You're with Julian on a brown note and a review of the new JPEGMAFIA album. In a year that has been absolutely the best for really strong album length rap projects for nearly a decade, I've moaned and moaned that the quality of the sort of, I guess, embodied by the Travis Scott era just hasn't done it for me, and a lot of those mumble adjacent or cloud rap adjacent rappers have not really done anything for Xanax adjacent rappers have done anything for me. And again, there's this promulgation of relentless praise to a lot of female rappers that are probably, Little Simz, absolutely superb. A lot of the rest have just not been that interesting, but they get this kudos. So for an old head, and obviously I'm an old man, and I have the Yo Bum Rush's Show album on vinyl downstairs from 1986, it's not been a great era for rap music at all. Like 2010 to 2015, there was so much, and since then it's been a terrible era, and I've gone on at length about the quality of album length projects this year, even from people like Keith Chief, who's been very consistent in my opinion, and Schoolboy Q coming back. There's just been a lot of very strong album lengths this year, and this one is definitely in there. Barrington DeVaughn Hendrix has become almost the king of underground rap. His previous album last year, the Scaring the Hose one with Danny Brown, was one of the highlights of last year, and it's almost that Danny Brown and JPEG are kings of that realm at the moment, with Danny Brown being a little bit less over the last few years than JPEG has, who's sort of come up, whereas Danny Brown might have reached his peak and does come back. I mean, Scaring the Hose was fantastic. This one is the fifth studio album, I Lay Down My Life For You by JPEGMAFIA, and he's very prolific. So this doesn't cover the entirety 5 studio albums of what he's put out, Little B style, that he's put out an enormous amount of stuff, but he's come to be the most interesting, and this one is a Like Atrocity exhibition by Danny Brown, is an enormous left turn, yet one that is analogous to the direction that he was moving already. It's mainly due to the incredible amount of depth or thrash or heavy metal that is on this album, where you could take probably 30% of it and just present it as a death metal or a heavy metal album and get away with it. He opens interestingly with a lyric, well, not a lyric, but he mentions that he's the equivalent of Dylan Brooks, who, I don't know anything about basketball, but apparently the Dylan Brooks thing goes that Dylan Brooks massively badmouthed someone like LeBron James, and then when they went into their finals matches got annihilated. And JPEG sees himself in this someone who's a massive loudmouth who has put it all on the line and lost. The first thing that strikes you about this album, and I just reviewed the Jack White album, is that I could have been carrying on listening to the Jack White album. The enormous, thunderous, heavy riffing on this album was so completely... I was like, am I still listening to the Jack White album and there's a rap track after this? Because when I first heard the albums, I heard both of them back to back. I was like, what is going on here? The live drums, bass and guitars are fantastic, and the aggressive vocals, not for the only time, the most obvious artist to compare them to is Death Grips, and it's got that really sort of heavy, thunderous riffing with aggressive barking down the microphone. And it also gets into almost like, Sunbather melodic death metal as well. And I think the titles of the tracks are very important on this album, because I think the only area where I wasn't fully getting across what he was intending here is the lyrics, and I'm not going to mention many of them, but they were sometimes the most pedestrian part of such a wild album. I didn't think the lyrics particularly stood out much, but the titles do. I scream this in the mirror before I interact with anyone. The opening track title, which is some of the tracks have titles that seem to say more about the song than the actual lyrics do. The second one is definitely got this Death Grips vibe again. Simiendo, one of the strongest tracks on the album. Pummeling, and then it sort of gets this almost alt pop, but a little bit too heavy to be alt pop, sort of bass and synthetic bass drums thing going on. This sort of Black Sabbath heavy riffing comes back as well, and it's a really good combination on this track. I think it's one of the high points where he manages to meld the alt pop, hip hop, and the heavy riffing of guitars and drums and bass that really work well together and sort of complement each other as well. And it's got this really funky Dr. Octagon sort of breakdown. It's not all the way through. I'll Be Right is a much more soulful track, and it's got this really nice vocal hook and some strings and some old school production on it. It's a soulful sounding track. One of the commonalities on this album is the reference points he puts out there, and DMX, a legendary rapper. I love DMX. It's dark and hell is hot. Legendary. I think that was the first DMX album. It's the title of this track, and it's got really sort of skittish, glitchy, clubby beats, and many of the times on this album where it's sort of monstrously heavy and then goes funky with this fat bass sound. I did think of LP's production on Run the Jewels a lot on this album. Even though the album overall is not that much close to Run the Jewels, it's still sort of a bit more anarchic. And I love the Brazil end, Brazil at the end. Vince Staples turns up on track 5, New Black History, which is the best turn on the album, with virtually no features on it. He's fantastic. Very, very good. More like, it almost reminded me a bit of Yeezus at times on this album, how wild it was, particularly on this track. And like the final moments of this very abrasive, high-pitched squealing noises that reminded me of the Aphex Twins Ventolin. The reference points that JPEGMAFIA must have in the music that he likes to listen to and is influenced by are probably phenomenally interesting. Track 6, Don't Rely on Other Men. Again, the titles are probably the more interesting lyrical element than the lyrics on a lot of the tracks. Very heavy riffing returns, not so much the squalling guitars, but just this like death disco sort of bass going on. I like the Daft Punk track, The Funk, where it's just this doo, 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 doo. And an epic in 3 minutes as well, and some wailing guitar solos that sound a little bit like the music of the Top Gun soundtrack, where it was very 80s sort of wailing guitar, which was fantastic as well. Bit of either punk metal or maybe even new metal on the vulgar display of power, and a great hook. The I Bring the Pain hook was fantastic. Again, all these rap albums have got so many tracks, it's hard to get through them all. Extra Military, track 8, is very telling as well, because it throws in so many meta references, like Extra Military, another reference to Death Grips, probably the most prominent reference on this album, but also the fact that JPEGMAFIA was in the military as well. It's got this, again, another one, the Wu-Tang Clan Tears sample, the iconic sample that the Wu-Tang Clan used on the track of Tears from the 36 Chambers album, is used here almost as a goading element to say, I'm ballsy enough to take the same sample as this classic and pulls it off. It's an epic track. It's amazing. A bit more run the jewels as well, and got some metal breakdowns in the middle. And he's talked about his own past, plus Death Grips, plus metal, plus the Wu-Tang Clan. One of the highlights of the album. Jihad Joe, the cover of this album is very provocative, and he does mention the IDF, and he does mention the Palestinian side on this album lyrically, and the cover seems to be like, this track's called Jihad Joe, a famous British jihadist, famous for that knife picture, and he kind of looks like this guy on the cover standing behind a Christian cross. Deliberately provocative. And probably the most famous line on the album, I'm so terminally online I can't stand myself. And it's got one of the heaviest riffs by the halfway stage, with this siren blaring in the background as well. Denzel Curry turns up perfectly fine. The lyrics, again, across the whole album, occasionally they're fantastic and occasionally they're rote, and possibly the same for that Denzel Curry track, but he's perfectly fine on it. I did like relating back to that thing about the Christian cross and the jihadist looking JPEG below it. If I can't pray to a God I don't fear, I thought that was very interesting. And it's got this sort of spacey production with a sort of acoustic element going on into it. The best sample on the album, either on or off the drugs, has a great soulful sample on it, very, very nice. And it continues into sort of a more spacey, transcendental track, Loop It or Leave It, which doesn't function as a song so much as an instrumental interlude with occasional lyrics over the top, to the most interesting and, I guess, challenging, or not even challenging, it's not challenging at all, but the fact that he starts a track, Don't Put Anything on the Bible, with this almost unbroken 2 minutes of Buzzy Lee playing this very sort of folksy female song, Beth Orton / Beth Gibbons style modern folk song. Really interesting and very unexpected and almost trip hopish. And then it sort of fades out with I Recovered From This, with another female, this time I would say Imogen Heap style sort of vocal, and a very sort of acoustic, I think it's 2 tracks in a row where the acoustic guitar turns up very often, and it sort of ends on a wisp. It's an unusually low-key ending for an album that's so balls out and bombastic on the death metal through the opening half. It's a kind of a low-key end. As an album, it is probably the most close to something as daring as Danny Brown's Atrocity Exhibition, and it's absolutely fantastic. Tiny quibbles here and there, particularly as it sort of it feels like it tapers off a bit at the end, but overall a fantastic album. And even though I've forgotten the title, I Lay Down My Life For You by JPEGMAFIA is certainly establishing him as almost above Tyler the Creator at the moment in this sort of world of rap. I couldn't give a shit about Travis Scott or anything like that, but as somebody capable of making the most interesting albums rather than just a 20-track album full of an enormous amount of guest artists and based around 4 big tracks. This is definitely an artist that's tried to sculpt an entire album very successfully. Loving the incredible amount of metal on this album. It would have been very interesting for him to have done the whole album in that vein and done like a Rain in Blood Slayer album of rap, which I'm sure Death Grips have thought about doing. But he comes closer than they ever did to doing it here. A very solid 8.5 out of 10 for I Lay Down My Life For You by JPEGMAFIA.